Okay, I'm joined by Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Waterloo, the Director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Futures, and a collaborator with the NCF project. So the Pew Research Center has recently released a major report, the Religious Landscape Study for 2023 to 2024. And this is about the changing religious demographics in the United States. So Sarah, in your view, what was the most important finding in this report?
Okay, well, hi everyone. Hi Nathan. This is like it's NCF Reacts, right? So this is my reaction face, like, okay. I mean, the most important finding, I think, is maybe the one that Pew puts in the title of the report. So the title of that report is "Decline of Christianity in the U.S. has slowed, may have leveled off." And that's definitely the trend that a lot of Christian commentators in the U.S. have just kind of taken at face value and run with in some of their commentary online. So I want to dig in a bit on that title and actually what the Pew Research Center and the report here is actually showing, because I feel the title is a bit misleading on this front. So yeah, you mentioned this report's based on Pew's religious landscape study findings from the recent wave that they ran in 2023, 2024. So this is a nationally representative probability sample of just under 37,000 people. So it's a great survey, and I'm always excited when Pew releases the data from these survey. And so to come back to the title, right? The title of this report makes it sound like religious declines might have actually petered off for good in the US. And like I mentioned, that's a narrative that's kind of now been picked up from this report. However, I feel the actual Pew data in the report shows something a little bit different. So it shows long-term religiosity declines in the US between 2007, so the last time Pew ran this survey, and the recent 2023, 2024 wave. But it also does show a plateauing of some of the religiosity indicators and their share of the population. So things like Christian affiliation, frequent religious service attendance, and frequent prayer. So there's been a plateauing of those indicators in the population since around 2019, so just before the pandemic. So that means those indicators are pretty stable over the last few years, so since 2019. But I feel after looking at their data and just other data in general about the US, it's probably too early to say if this recent plateauing actually means the end of religious declines in the US, as some are hoping, or actually just a short-term pause to those declines, and then potentially leading to further declines in the future, right? So what we've seen in other countries, in Europe and Canada, is that when we see religious decline, it's not always linear, right? So for example, here in Canada, rates of religious affiliation in the general population began declining around the early 1970s, but they did plateau in Statistics Canada's general social surveys between about 2010 and 2017. And then they started to decline again since then. So, I mean, sometimes these declines, they don't always go at the same speed. They don't always happen, linearly across time. There's kind of pauses sometimes, slowing, plateauing. But at least in Canada, a lot of European countries, even despite those kind of shifts in the speed of decline, that decline has continued. And it is worth mentioning here, and this is like my little stats nerd coming into play, that the most recent Pew Landscape study here does have a new methodology to it. So this before in 2017, in 2007 and 2014, the survey was ran by telephone. And then more recently, they switched for the most recent wave. So it's now a mixed mode survey. So a bit of online and telephone surveying with an initial mail out invitation to people. And so whenever you see a change in these methodologies of surveys, we should be a little bit cautious about looking at the trends between those surveys. We should probably wait for the next round, the next time Pew does this with the same mixed mode methodology, to make sure that these trends are not just kind of artificial survey design effects. But more broadly, Pew even lists in the report a number of other reasons why we might expect to see further religious declines in the US in the years to come. And I guess that's why I find their title a bit puzzling. In their title of the report, they imply that the declines are over, but in the actual report, they're implying that the declines, there's more to come. And the major reason being that those religiosity indicators are much lower, are much weaker amongst young adults. So the kind of youngest adult birth cohorts that they're measuring, so kind of younger millennials and the first Gen Z folks. And so, according to data in this report, for example, there's only 46% of young adults in the US between the ages of 18 and 24 who identify as Christian. Only 27% pray daily, and only 25% attend religious services at least once a month. Now, I know to our European and Canadian colleagues, that actually might sound like a lot, but for the US, that's actually really low, and that's much lower than older adults in the US. And so we should expect that as these younger birth cohorts kind of become middle-aged adults, move into kind of full adulthood, older generations pass away, that their trends would be more reflected in the survey data. So that means further declines in religiosity indicators in the US. And, Pew also shows in this report that there's not much evidence for people getting more religious as they get older. It's actually the opposite. For example, Gen X, born in the 70s, fewer of them are certain about their belief in God now than they were in 2007. And so it's actually people over time, over as they age, in this case, at least in recent years, have been getting less religious, not more. And so that's kind of my main feeling about this report is the title sounds like declines are over, but the report itself is actually saying, well, they're plateauing, they're slowing a bit for now, but we should expect bigger declines coming forward. And that's kind of what I'm expecting in the years to come in the US for these declines to continue.
Hmm. No, that's really interesting. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about the generational things, but I think you've addressed that. I want to ask, like you mentioned the big kind of finding, I suppose, is this plateau. But was there any other things that maybe might slip under the radar that you found interesting about the report?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great report. It's very extensive. It's very rich and detailed in its findings. So there's lots of great stuff there for anyone who's interested in the American religious landscape. So some other kind of a few key other findings that I noticed in the report that are not to do with that plateauing is actually that evangelical Protestants have seen a modest decline in their share of the U.S. population between 2007 and 2024. Not a whole lot. So they went from about 26% of the US population in 2007 to 23% last year. So that's interesting because usually there's this impression sometimes that evangelical Protestantism is doing well in the US. But recent Pew numbers, as well as other surveys, are showing that's not necessarily the case, that their numbers are softening as well. So that most Christian traditions, including Catholicism, evangelical Protestantism, mainline Protestantism, they've all seen declines in their population share over the last few decades. And yeah, another interesting finding that I thought was interesting was the gender gap in religiosity seems to be narrowing in the US. So women have always, or at least as long as we've been surveying, have been usually on average more religious than men, and including in the US. But those differences between genders seem to be much less pronounced now in the US than they used to be. And that's a trend that a number of countries have been picking up on recently. So I thought that was really interesting. And by contrast, the political gap in religion is growing in the US, right? So there's a larger share of political liberals who are leaving Christianity between 2007 and 2024, compared with a smaller share of political conservatives who have left Christianity over that same time period. And then maybe finally, it's worth mentioning that immigrants are also showing signs of these religious declines between 2007 and 2024. So that some people think that maybe immigrants are immune to this decline, but they're not. This demographic is also seeing some of these religious declines in the US.
All right. Well, thanks, Sarah. This has been super helpful, I think, for kind of highlighting some of the key things that people should take away from this report.
Yeah, I
So
mean it's a
thank you.
great report. Go read it. If you're at all interested in American religion and the American religious landscape, go read that report. We'll put the link for it in the description box below. Pew always does great data research and reports, and it's also worth mentioning that survey data eventually becomes open access. So Pew is great at
Mm.
releasing its data to everyone. So at some point, not right yet, but like maybe in the next couple of years, all researchers will get access to the raw data of this survey and so can actually start analyzing it, crunching it themselves to address a wider array of research questions and goals. So if ever you're looking for some great survey data for the US, Pew is a great place for that. And this religious landscape study is a great survey. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Thank you, Sarah.
Oh, all right. Thanks, Nathan. Bye, everyone.